Let's shatter some heavily romanticized history today. We so often picture the end of the British Empire as this grand ideological shift or some purely political evolution. But the sources we're looking at for this explainer paint a very, very different picture. It's a much more mathematical reality. We're going to dive straight into the stark, undeniable economic facts, what our sources call the financial backbreak, that truly brought the empire to its knees.
Okay, let's dive right into this massive contradiction. Picture May 8, 1945, VE Day. Millions of people are dancing in the streets of London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill is waving from his balcony, the Union Jack is flying high. There's absolute jubilation, right? Because Britain had just won the most horrific war in history. They defeated Hitler. They were, ostensibly, the conquerors of the world. But behind those cheering crowds and decorated walls, a really bitter truth was being hidden. The reality was that victorious Britain was actually completely bankrupt, broken, and desperate. The sheer scale of this bankruptcy is just staggering. 21 billion pounds. 6 agonizing years of global warfare had completely shattered the backbone of the British economy. They emerged from the war not with a surplus of wealth to rule the globe, but with a crushing debt exceeding 21 billion pounds. The very empire that had spent centuries extracting wealth from all around the world was now entirely reliant on American loans just to keep the lights on. The glowing coin of the British pound had literally shattered. And let's look at what this meant on the ground for everyday people. The so-called victors of the world were returning home to a scene of utter devastation. We're talking over 400,000 British casualties and millions of homes reduced to rubble. Normal life was just a distant memory. Their factories were ruined and international trade had essentially flatlined. And here's the most striking contrast. The citizens of this supposed world-conquering empire were forced to stand in endless ration lines just to get basic necessities like bread, milk, and clothes. They were flat broke. This absolute economic collapse at home forced a brutal shift in their overseas strategy, bringing us to Part 1, the colonial mathematics. This brilliantly illustrates the core problem Britain was facing. The sources distill imperialism down to a shockingly simple, undeniable formula. Ruling a colony isn't just about political grandstanding or historical legacy. It's a mathematical equation. To hold a territory, you absolutely must have 2 primary resources: money and an army. And as we've just seen from the domestic reality, Britain had completely run out of the first one. And as we're about to see, they were rapidly losing the second. Just look at how this math applied to the real world by 1946. The government's coffers were totally empty. They literally could not afford to pay the salaries required to maintain their massive overseas military presence. And on the human side, total exhaustion. After fighting a grueling 6-year world war, British troops had absolutely zero desire to be shipped off to places like India, Burma, or Africa just to suppress local independence movements. They were drained, they were tired, and they simply wanted to go home. The equation was failing on both sides. Which brings us to a specific event that served as the final nail in the coffin for British rule. Part 2, the turning point, the 1946 naval mutiny. In February 1946, in the city of Bombay, a terrifying realization struck the British government. 20,000 Indian sailors of the Royal Indian Navy suddenly and decisively mutinied. This wasn't some small protest. This was a massive, organized revolt by the exact people employed to enforce British rule. And during the revolt, the mutineers took a highly symbolic step. They literally took down the British flags from the ships and hoisted their own. By lowering those flags, these sailors proved to London that the bedrock of their power was just gone. Britain realized in that very moment that the Indian military forces they had relied on to sustain their rule for 200 years were no longer loyal to the crown. This quote directly from the source material really sums up the terrifying wake-up call for London. It's a stark realization of their vulnerability. If a major rebellion occurred, Britain lacked the money and the manpower to stop it. They had no funds to mount a counteroffensive, and they had no reliable manpower to fight it. That illusion of control had completely evaporated. This harsh reality brings us straight inside 10 Downing Street, where newly elected Prime Minister Clement Attlee faced an impossible situation. Part 3, profit versus burden. Attlee had to look at the cold, hard facts. For centuries, colonies like India were considered the golden bird, this highly profitable venture that funneled massive wealth back into the British economy. But the situation had completely inverted. India and other colonies had transformed into a massive, untenable financial drain. Britain simply no longer had the cash to keep such a vast golden bird in its cage. Holding on to the empire wasn't a source of pride anymore. It was a huge burden that threatened to sink the entire British economy. I mean, even Winston Churchill, who fiercely wanted to keep the empire, had to face this reality.
Faced with this undeniable economic and military backbreak, the empire's strategy had to pivot. Part 4. The strategic withdrawal.
British leadership completely abandoned their long-standing policy of imperial preservation. There was no longer any serious talk of holding on to the territories indefinitely. Instead, the policy shifted entirely to organizing a managed exit, packing up the crown, so to speak. It was a forced hand. The colonial math dictated that they had to leave, so the only real question left was how they would leave. So, the British leadership made a highly revealing calculation. They decided it was far better to quickly pack their bags and leave on their own terms, maybe with some manufactured semblance of honor, rather than waiting to be kicked out. The alternative was facing a massive revolt they literally couldn't afford to fight, resulting in them being forcibly and humiliatingly removed. They chose the hasty, managed exit. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. When we look back at the end of the British Empire, history books so often frame it as a graceful handover of power. But based on the staggering debt, the empty coffers, and the mutinying forces we've explored today, did the empire leave out of grace or simply because it could no longer afford to pay the bill? Keep questioning the history you think you know, and thanks for joining me.